This week on The Review, how to cover a devastating natural disaster, caught on camera investigating Britain's fake marriage brokers, and the protests in Baltimore, USA that had you talking. Hello and welcome to The Review, the show that goes behind the scenes here at Al Jazeera, but also lets you do the talking. The biggest story of the week was undoubtedly the devastating 7.8 magnitude earthquake in Nepal, which has claimed the lives of nearly 5,000 people. And it's a number that is sadly set to rise. Now, when it hit on Saturday, Al Jazeera's news team had to quickly decide how best to respond. We wanted to know how our news colleagues rose to the challenge of covering the disaster, but we were also curious about the moral and ethical dilemmas our journalists face on such occasions. So we asked for your questions on that theme, and in a moment we'll be putting them to the network's head of news gathering. But first, let's take a look back at the stories that had you clicking and sharing.
Oh! No!
After his funeral, the family of Freddie Gray had pleaded for peaceful protests against the police accused of responsibility for his death. What happened instead was waves of young people roaming the streets of Baltimore's poorest neighborhoods.
It was a painful journey for those who had to say farewell to their relatives. 9 families from all over the world gathered at this Indonesian port to leave for a prison island for the last time before the executions.
The radio stations are crucial at a time like this. People in the city depend on them to know where the police and the protesters have been clashing, and across the whole country people depend on it to know what the government's doing, what the politicians are saying, and what the activists are saying too. It's the main form of mass communication here in Burundi.
Nigeria's military say these are some of the 293 women and children rescued. They were held in severe and inhumane conditions, the military says. Many are hoping that some of those rescued are the Chibok schoolgirls. They were abducted by Boko Haram in April last year.
The 6 officers included those who first arrested Gray for carrying a knife, which the prosecutor said was not illegal. The charges range from manslaughter to assault, misconduct, and false imprisonment.
And every morning I hope that it was a nightmare, but it's not. I mean, you don't wake out of this nightmare. It's a continuation. And Nepal has no choice but to rebuild.
Okay, so back to that Nepal story and how the network puts together its coverage. We're joined now by Heather Allen, who's Al Jazeera English's head of news gathering. Heather, thank you so much for joining us. One of the first questions I wanted to ask you was, what is the first question a news team must ask when deciding to cover a story like a natural disaster?
You know, Renee, we're not unlike the big aid agencies that go into to cover disasters. Our first questions are, can we get there? How do we get there? What do we take? Are there communications on the ground? Is there transport? Are the airports open? If we do get in, is it nighttime? Is it daytime? Are there land arrangements that we can make in advance? So we really are like the aid agencies. You know, it's like a natural disaster has happened. You've got to go in and you ask the same sorts of questions. What do we do when we get there?
Well, you know, we see so much war and chaos happening all around the world on a daily basis. How do you decide when something is a story, when to deploy a team?
Well, there's levels of it. Certainly the big natural disasters are no-brainers for us. And natural disasters are the easy ones to cover. Really big civil unrest is another one that hits a critical point. If there's a lot of people on the street, if there's a lot of mayhem and destruction, you tend to go in for those as well.
Now, what challenges do the journalists face in Nepal right now on a daily basis?
I mean, right now in Nepal, it was a real challenge to get in. There was a small airport, one runway, so the plane circled and circled and circled and circled and circled, and eventually they put down. So a trip that should have taken 4 hours was taking almost 12 hours to get in. So just getting in was the single biggest problem we had. In the case of Kathmandu, it's a smallish city. You could see the destruction from the minute you stepped off the plane. The airport itself was damaged. Every time there was an aftershock, the people in the control tower left the control tower.
And that just means that the story is so fluid and things are developing so quickly. So how do you take into account the fluidity of a story?
Well, what we try to do, and because we were very lucky, we have a resident correspondent in Kathmandu. She held the fort. She was up. She was on an uplink. She was giving us information. She was feeding us information. We were in turn feeding it to our troops that were just coming in, and so what we were able to do was establish a beachhead, if you like, get somebody up, running, move the next team out further, correct, into rotation, and an ever widening circle around the city and into the valleys.
So when does the story kind of die down a bit? When do you start to scale back on your coverage?
Right now, because of the terrain of Nepal and the challenges, the geographical challenges, the amount of aftershocks they've had, we're going to be there for some time, and we're not going to throttle back for at least the first 10 days because we still don't have it's an awful thing to say, but we don't have a stable death count. We don't know how many of the injured, and there's terrible injuries, are going to survive. The aid hasn't reached the outer parts of the country. I mean, it's still a very fluid, vibrant story for us, so we're going to be there for some time.
Heather, our viewers have been asking us a lot of questions on social media about the ethical dilemma that reporters face when reporting on disaster zones. Diana Thompson wrote on Facebook, "What ethical conflicts appear when reporters confront death and displacement and when sources are emotionally the most vulnerable? Where's the line between morbid curiosity and the public's right to know? How should reporters treat victims?"
I'm only talking about myself and the people who work for me and the ethics I expect them to work to. At all times in these events, the victims are human beings. They've had a terrible thing happen to them. Sometimes they're injured, sometimes they've lost family members, they're almost always distraught. Any given shoot, that is the priority. If they're upset, you put the camera down. You respect them at all times as a hurt human being. If you have to stop shooting to help, you stop shooting to help. We are not the story. We should never ever be the story. I leave it up to each individual cameraman, producer and reporter to do the right thing. And by that I mean if you don't get the story because you put down to help, then that's what you do. If at any time you see that the person you're talking to, the survivors, are getting really upset, back off. At the end of the day, it's their story and they're the ones being affected, and you have to respect that. I always encourage people, never do things like, do something as simple as drink water in front of thirsty people. Don't eat in front of hungry people. Always be aware of what they've gone through. And I think we do that pretty well. And it's a thing that all my life I've tried to instill in people that work for me. And that's how we do it. Now, the right to know, the public right to know, the public should know, not just the general global public, but the people in the country or the town or whatever that's being affected. You can do that in graphics, you can do it back in the studio. You don't have to do that with in the scene of the disaster.
Our other news spotlight of the week, Baltimore, Maryland, and the reactions to the death of 25-year-old Freddie Gray, who died while in police custody. We've received mixed feedback on our coverage. Kira Dolcemascalo had this to say about a news article on Al Jazeera's website. "I expect better reporting from Al Jazeera. I'm here in Baltimore. This is a very limited soundbite of a story." One particular video report evoked response. Eva Katrina wrote, "Shihab Britansi, excellent report on Al Jazeera English last night, re Baltimore. Great facts as opposed to hype by people who were not there as you were." And here's the report that Eva was referring to.
This is the surreality of what we're seeing. Of 2 blocks away is that drugstore that was set alight. Fire crews we understand, still attempting to put out the blaze. In fact, I'm just standing in front of a fire hydrant that they're using. But around me, the neighborhood is completely peaceful. It's just a slightly chilly spring evening. You'd never know anything amiss, except for, clearly, the line of police officers in full riot gear behind me. This is little pockets of unrest that we're seeing around the town. So we need to put that into context, first of all.
We're constantly monitoring what you have to say about Al Jazeera's coverage, so do get involved and join our feedback community. And finally this week, in the first of a two-part special report, Al Jazeera's People in Power went to the United Kingdom to investigate the shady world of fake marriages for visas. Its undercover journalists targeted the criminals who are making a fortune selling the services of bogus brides.
नहीं, लड़की जब आपके पास इनके पास रहेगी तो आईडी सब इनके हवाले होगी। उसमें अगर लड़की आपके साथ उसकी अंडरस्टैंडिंग नहीं होती है, उसके आपके साथ नहीं चल रही है या आप उससे खुश नहीं है, कोई 100 मसला हैपन हो जाता है, लेकिन आप लड़की के साथ आपको किसी किस्म की कोई प्रॉब्लम नहीं है, ठीक है, वो मेरी हेडेक होगी, फिर मैं आपको उसी हिसाब में मैं चेंज करके दूसरी लड़की आपको दे सकता हूँ। ये भी मेरा एक आपसे यानी ऑप्शन।
क्या कहते हैं हम? लड़की देते हुए 8,000 देने।
नहीं, लड़की में 4,000 देने, 2,000 की 2 इंस्टॉलमेंटें होंगी।
दूसरी कोई बात बनी?
हाँ, वो कह रही है लड़की ये सारा कुछ 24 साल की।
अच्छा, 24 साल की। कंट्री कौन सी है?
हंगरी की। ठीक है।
पैसे कितने बोल रही है?
नहीं यार, क्या होगा, ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा 8 होगा और क्या होगा।
If you have any thoughts about that film or the second part of the report next week, then let us know. Otherwise, that'll do it for now. Thank you so much for engaging with us about our coverage. Please keep your questions and comments coming, and maybe next week you could be on the review.